from Hong Kong. I'm Christine Lowe, and I have the privilege of moderating this panel with three speakers today. I know you're logging in because you want to discuss national security. The new national security law in Hong Kong is probably the hottest topic right now. It is a very complex issue. It has a history. The law is complicated and the enforcement structure is also complicated. But we have three excellent experts today to share some of their views with us. And also later on, we would like to take some of your questions. So do send them in as and when you can. The first person on the panel is Professor Richard Cullen. He is visiting professor at the Faculty of Law, the University of Hong Kong. He has had many, many years teaching public law in Hong Kong. His most recent book is on Hong Kong's constitution, the Basic Law. Our second panelist is Tony Kwok. Tony Kwok was the Deputy Commissioner and Head of Operations of Hong Kong's famous Independent Commission Against Corruption. He has spent many years also advising other governments around the world on how to set up laws and structures to enforce tough anti-corruption legislation. Our third panelist is Chandran Nair. He's the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow. He is also a well-known author of several well-known books on the subject of governance and economic models. And one of the things that he captures about the world today is the rise of the rest of the world. So we have three excellent panelists who can come from different directions to explore the issue of national security. Let me turn first to Professor Cullen. Richard, tell us something about national security as a concept, and also how countries put together national security laws, and then bring us to Hong Kong about the new legislation.
Okay, thanks, Christine. I think a good place to start when looking at the concept is to look how old it is. The first national security law in the United Kingdom was passed just on 700 years ago, the first Treason Act. And another current critic of our national security law in Hong Kong, US, they passed their first national security law over 200 years ago in 1798, very shortly after the establishment of the US. I've got a quote here from a Harvard professor, Professor Johnston, who says that the most fundamental norms in modern international relations have historically been sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that's what national security is all about, protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity. But different nations do it in different ways, but the fundamentals are much the same. These are unusual laws because they criminalise acts against the state. Penalties are usually quite stringent. But let me just now move on after that brief outline to look at the background, a bit of the background to the creation of the law in Hong Kong. Firstly, a lot's been said about how, by critics, that the national security law is contrary to the Joint Declaration. Well, legally, that just does not stand up. Let's think about what the Joint Declaration does. It's an important international treaty between Britain and China, but that's all it is. It's a treaty. It's a shaping document. It's not a constitutional document in the sense of providing the foundation for Hong Kong's constitutional structure. In the Joint Declaration, in fact, it declares that it's part of Beijing's basic policy to maintain sovereignty and territorial integrity. Not a job for the UK or any other parties at all. So the constitutional foundation on which the national security law rests is the Basic Law and the PRC Constitution. Now, I just wanted to say a few words about the Basic Law and national security law as well. We know that in Article 23 of the Basic Law, there's a provision, this provision says that Hong Kong on its own may make national security laws that affect the HKSAR.
This is the famous Article 23.
This is the famous Article 23, right. Note that it says on its own, but note that it does not say exclusively on its own. This is a concurrent power. The paramount power always for securing national security rests with the sovereign, and that is the PRC government in Beijing. So there's no contradiction between the national security law and Article 23. And indeed, Hong Kong is encouraged to pass its own national security law in due course. The other point to make about the Basic Law is how we ended up with the national security law. And the national security law is being passed by the Standing Committee of the NPC after being drafted within that organisation. And then in accordance with the Basic Law has been added to Annex 3, and then the law has been proclaimed in accordance with the Basic Law pursuant to Article 18 of the Basic Law. Now, people may quibble about or say they don't like this system, but it's in the Basic Law, and the Basic Law has long been recognised by, including the UK and the US, as the fundamental, elemental, foundational document. No one said it's anything less than that. So the national security law has been passed in a proper way, in my view. Now, finally, let me just talk a little bit about the purpose of the national security law in Hong Kong. Firstly, I divide this up into general and specific purpose. General purpose, I'd like to refer to some comments made by Andrew Sheng, who's the former chair of the SFC in Hong Kong and a distinguished fellow at the Asian Global Institute, in a presentation earlier this week. He used a very good example. He said, consider 4 leading international financial centres, New York, London, Singapore and Tokyo. In every one of those jurisdictions, there is robust national security law backing up the stability of those jurisdictions where the financial transactions take place. Indeed, in the likes of the US, there's well over 20 different national security laws, and similarly in Singapore. There is one, however, international financial centre, which until July the 1st did not have a modern comprehensive national security law system, and that was Hong Kong. And his argument essentially is this shows that this is something Hong Kong's lacked. Let me just move on now to specific purpose. October 4, 2018 is an important date, or it may become more important. This was the date that Vice President Mike Spence gave a speech to the Hudson Institute in Washington. And the leading serious journals in the US, including the New York Times, the Washington Post and Forbes magazine, all describe this as a declaration by the United States of a new Cold War directed against China. So bear that in mind when you think that about 7 months after this great level of violent political opposition emerges in Hong Kong in response to the attempt to pass the extradition bill. Initial protests were peaceful, but then we encounter over 7 months of very violent protesting, doing horrific damage right across Hong Kong. And that's within the context of this new Cold War, which has continued to intensify right through until indeed this week. We've seen a bit more intensity on display. So Beijing had been very patient, I think, in the delay in passing a national security law. Article 23 years later, it's still not passed. And finally, they decided they had to do something about this themselves. To conclude, I think the primary function of all national security laws, and this one is no different, is deterrence. The idea is to deter people from taking up arms or becoming extremely violent in pursuing political aims and creating real instability and threatening the constitutional order of a given jurisdiction. Personally, I'm watchful about how it's going to work out. It's early days yet. But I have a essentially positive view looking ahead. I expect that the national security law will continue to have a deterrent effect. It plainly has already, but I think that it will continue to do this. And I will just finish up with a quote from South America. I think, indeed, South America or Latin America's most famous revolutionary, even more than Che Guevara, Simon Bolivar. And he said, "The worst enemy of freedom is anarchy." This is a lesson which many places have learnt, and I think we've relearnt again in Hong Kong over the last 12 months or so.
Well, Richard, thank you. Perhaps in the second round of our discussion, we can explore the issue of personal liberties, tough laws, and deterrence. But this is a good segue to really come to Tony Kwok. Richard talked about deterrence. Tough laws are there to deter people from doing certain things. And in your experience, you operated as head of operations, Hong Kong's toughest law, the ICAC anti-corruption legislation. Perhaps you can fill us in on what it's like for an enforcer of the law, looking at tough laws, deterrence, and how you think in Hong Kong this law is going to be operated and managed.
Thanks, Christine. Indeed, you are right. I liken the current national security problem in Hong Kong with that of the corruption problem in the 70s, when, as you're probably aware, Hong Kong at that time was probably one of the most corrupt places on earth. And then corruption was described as a way of life. It existed from womb to tomb. And so this is similar to our national security crisis for the last 13 months, when the separatist movement with violence, protests, etc., has caused a real challenge to the national security problem. So how Hong Kong succeed from turning from one of the most corrupt places to now regarded as generally one of the cleanest should be a good example to ensure the successful implementation of the national security law. So first thing I would say is that we need a strong organization. So ICC is indeed a very strong organization. We have 1,400 staff. And then indeed, we are regarded as one of the most professional anti-corruption, professional law enforcement agencies in the world. When any people are aware, our first director of operation actually came from the head of the former special branch of the police, and in fact recruited from the UK intelligence agency. So the ICC successful model was actually built on some kind of the UK intelligence unit. And to be fair, it's very professional because we have specialists in investigations. We have specialists in financial investigation. We have specialists in cybercrime. And then we have a very strong surveillance team, intelligence capability, undercover operation, forensic accountants, computer forensic, etc., etc. So this would be, I think, the framework of the unit, the police department unit, which are now responsible for this very important task. But as far as I'm aware, so far they said that they have about 200 staff. So my first observation is that probably they need to boost up their strength as much as possible. There's nothing wrong with that. As I recall, the former SB, former special branch, at that time they have 3,000 staff. Okay. The second thing we need is that we have strong law, as you said. We must have a very deterrent, strong law. And deterrent law means in the sense that you have a all-embracing offenses. But more importantly, we must have strong power. And there's nothing wrong with the strong power because you are not dealing with the ordinary street crime. We're dealing with the kind of a five eyes Five Eye spy networks with a lot of CIA, MI6, and then and espionage, etc. So we need strong law to be able to investigate this crime and particularly bring the big tiger into it. And so this law draconian or unfair? No, I don't think so, because all you need is to compare this kind of law with the similar law, similar national security law with all the other Western countries. They're all not dissimilar. If not, they are more harsher than us. The third thing is that, okay, we talk about deterrence, we talk about enforcement, but this is not enough. ICC success built on a Hong Kong invented three-pronged strategy. That we need enforcement deterrence, yes, but we also need prevention and education. And I'm glad that this national security law is all embracing. They have particular article to talk about prevention, particular article to talk about education. So this is a good law. And the fourth thing I think we need is partnership. Hong Kong cannot rely on the police department to just deal with the national security. I think everyone have a role. Particularly, the important partnership would be the prosecutors, the judiciary, and then other government departments, the business sector, and particularly the public. Rely very heavily on the public. So for example, the ICAC, the first thing ICAC did when it set up a 24 hours hotline for reporting. So similarly, I think we should encourage the public. If they have anything that's related to any crime under the national security law, they should be encouraged to report to the police. And talking about the partnership, for example, I can quote that we need a very strong partnership at that time with the judiciary. They have been very, very helpful. At that time, only in the first year of the operation of the ICAC, we have a Chief Justice guideline to say that on the sentencing, any public servant involved in bribery should normally be sentenced to at least 12 months imprisonment, unless there are exceptional circumstances. So they actually set a sort of a minimum standard for sentencing. So there's nothing wrong, therefore, if you look at the national security law, they actually put down some minimum sentences. So this is in compliance with the success factor of ICC. Secondly, there's another Chief Justice guideline to say that if any suspect or defendant who are willing to cooperate with the authority, prepared to divulge the whole truth of the matter, prepared to give evidence against the main culprit, then it's absolutely all right for the judge to reduce their sentence by 2/3. So this is a very important incentive. If he's supposed to be sentenced to three years imprisonment, it becomes 1 year. So you look at the National Security Law, Article 33, indeed mentioned this point. So what I'm saying is that this national security law actually is not invented in-house. It actually looked into all the other aspects in experiences, best practice all around the world, including the ICAC, to come up with this very comprehensive embracing law. So I believe that with the law, and if they would implement it in following these 4 key success factors, I'm sure Hong Kong, like the corruption problem, will be able to really overcome it and enable Hong Kong to become stable and prosper again. Thank you.
Oh, Tony, thank you very much. I think, Tony, you brought up this very important point of tough corruption laws. And when it was brought to Hong Kong in the 70s, well, we had to get used to it. We had to build the infrastructure. But I guess at that time, people wanted to deal with corruption. However, I think today the fear of many people is national security. People are not quite sure what it is. They're not quite sure the definition of the law, whether they'd get caught, and they're concerned that that will diminish their freedom of association and expression. So I think we'll come back to this issue later. For now, let's turn to Chandran. You're from Malaysia. You've lived in many different parts of the world. How do you look at this issue of tough law, freedom of expression, and deterrence?
Thank you, Christine. And I think I'm the least qualified of everyone here because I don't have a legal background, etc., nor an enforcement background. But I think I'll try and answer that question by addressing what both Richard and Tony have mentioned, which is the kind of geopolitics angle. So my views on the geopolitical sort of narratives that is now been brought to bear in Hong Kong predate many of these discussions, and I've written about it for at least a decade or so. And I think it's really interesting for me, almost feeling that much of what I was talking about and saying was prescient in what now has happened and unraveled in Hong Kong. And it's very good to write and stuff, but to live it is actually really interesting too. One doesn't want to cheer, but one's arguments seem to be validated over the last year here. So I think it's really important to understand the context in which this is happening. And I'd like to go back in this discussion about China, and perhaps also to broaden the discussion, given I'm not a legal expert, not an enforcement, to actually go back at this moment where we're talking about Black Lives Matter, etc., and quote Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali came to China in the late 70s, I believe, exactly which year, I don't know. But he said something to the Chinese people then. I think he was the second most famous world-recognized person at that time. There was not much TV or definitely no mobile phones. And he said that to the Chinese people, now that you're opening up, be ready for an almighty fight. This was back in the late 70s, I believe, an almighty fight. And at that point, Muhammad Ali was the one who stood up against going to Vietnam to fight. He said, I have no war with the yellow man. And he said to the Chinese people, you have to be ready for almighty fight because the West will now try and impose its order and customs on you and your culture, etc. So that's a really interesting context, I think, which I see these things. And for me, living through it, and now incidentally, it's so coincidental that the Black Lives Matters issue has taken a global, what can I say, a global sort of understanding as people question history, and particularly the history of the West. So I'm not coming here to bash the West, etc., but you have to understand the context. And the history of the West, in that context of Black Lives Matters, is now evolving into a wider inquiry about what actually happened over the last 400 years. And essentially what I argued, and I've argued before this, was essentially the preservation of white supremacy in the form of the preservation of essentially the powers of the West. And this has been couched in terms such as the global order, etc. But the Chinese, the Indians, and the Nigerians weren't involved in crafting the global order. And this is not left-wing polemic stuff. This is essentially the real politics of the world. The others want to say. So why is it relevant to this? In my view, we are now at the first phase of the birth of what I call the post-Western world. And this is very troubling for those who have essentially written the rules over the last 300-400 years. Again, I want to caution people about thinking I'm having a bash at the West, etc. This is the world we live in. And it's understandable that those who have written the rules for 300-400 years will now feel very insecure. They're more enlightened Europeans, the Germans, etc., given their history, kind of understand, hey, we know what happened. The Americans don't seem to, for all the reasons that we won't explore now, and therefore they're leading the charge. But the post-Western world is essentially manifesting itself in the most powerful way through the rise of China, right? And in my view, Hong Kong is essentially the portal to disrupt and destabilize China. You could even call Hong Kong the first child of the post-Western world, and it's the orphan that is being kicked around. And that is a very important understanding. Therefore, when I look at what that means in terms of the context of what I write about and speak about, I think the very interesting thing that is happening in the world is that essentially we're going to have to live in a world in the 21st century, particularly my views about economic models, sharing, constraints, etc., in a world in which the previous economic and governance model, which is essentially shaped by the West, are out of date. We're going to have something very different. And that requires a real understanding that the old order in which the Western world for the last 70 years was essentially wrote the rules is no more relevant. Others will want to be part of that. China's challenge obviously will be to make sure that they don't replace the United States and start bossing everybody around either. So I think that's very important for China to do. So coming back to Hong Kong has to decide how and understand, and that's the education part, I think, what role it plays at this very historic moment of the birth of the post-Western world, and therefore the issue of freedoms, etc. I have stated this well before this, that I don't think in the 21st century any of us can see our freedoms as unfettered. This is religion in the United States, and we can see where you see your freedoms as unfettered, unconstrained by anything, any social obligations. There's no obligation to the collective welfare. We've seen the sorry mess, and we all hope the United States will recover from what's happening there. But that is essentially 60, 70 years of exceptionalism. We in Hong Kong need to understand that sort of thinking is essentially, apart from calling it selfish, blinkered, etc., it's completely unsuited to the 21st century. So we have a lot of work here to do to understand that our liberties are essentially constrained by essentially how they will affect the liberties of others. Our freedoms have to be essentially within the framework of essentially great constraints, etc. I always cheekily say that in Asia, car ownership cannot be a human right if you look at essentially emissions and all of those things. And finally, my point would be that in terms of the law, I think China and the Hong Kong government must play this very carefully, right? Much of the Western world, and I'm very careful, I don't say the world, because the majority, I think, are more neutral, waiting to see. But the Western world seems to be obsessed with this idea that China is imposing some draconian rules and repressing freedoms, etc. As a person who's as a citizen of Malaysia, when I was born, my parents were most interested when we were all, they were migrants from India. Stability, law and order, a government that did not abuse anybody, but allowed people to be educated, go to school, all of those things. And we lived with some very draconian rules, which are still being used at times by the Malaysian government, but they were all set out by the British. And I'm not going to say those were bad rules necessarily, but they were, particularly at that time, used to contain the rise of communism, etc. So in Hong Kong, I would urge everyone, or all sides, no matter what T-shirt you wear, chill, listen. We have an obligation to make the society better. Don't take sides, because there are no winners necessarily in this game. And then we have to work together here to make a better Hong Kong. And the obligation of the governments, especially the Chinese government, is to be aware that everyone is watching in the West, and people in Hong Kong too, and rightly so. And so don't overreach, be very careful. I have faith in the sense that the Hong Kong judicial system, and I've been, I'm a permanent resident, but, I was not born in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's been very good to me. And I have a great faith that the Hong Kong system will withstand this if allowed to do its job. So the United States, etc., need to also relax, okay, draw caution, etc. But let's not kick Hong Kong around like a football. And China needs to act very carefully. And I think, as Richard said, China was forced to act, but it needs to act very carefully. And I remain optimistic, but the proof will be in the pudding of how everyone behaves, and particularly in terms of how the judicial system in Hong Kong adopts to the new law.
Well, thank you to all three of you for teasing out a number of important strands to our discussion. And let me see in our second round of discussion, before we open it up to the audience, each one of these strands. So the first one, both Richard and Chandran, you've taken it up at a high level. Richard, you refer to the growing US-China conflict. Chandran, you've taken it even at a higher level of the transition in the world from perhaps a more Western institutionalized set of principles to something else. And in what you've written about before, the rise of the rest versus what we had of the West, I think is an interesting point. And Tony talked about institutions on the ground, how to build it up. So if we were to take one of the key issues is Hong Kong people feel very nervous right now because they're not quite sure whether they're subverting or whether they're just disagreeing. So this notion of dissent, legitimate dissent, versus subverting the government or the state. So I think I do want to hear from you about the issue of freedom of expression. Now, secondly is the stakes are very high for us in Hong Kong. If we see, as Chandran has described, this notion of Hong Kong as the battleground, you call it the portal, the battleground of East and West, or ideology versus ideology. You asked us to be calm, wise, and collected and stay cool. I'd be interested to hear more about what this means. And then the third issue is, but people in Hong Kong on a day-to-day basis is trying to explore the structure of the new system here, where we have obviously the police and the judiciary, the Department of Prosecution, all lined up to deal with the national security law. But we also have a mainland Chinese special national security office in Hong Kong. So perhaps this is a special question for Tony. How do you think these two parallel structures are going to work? And how can we reassure Hong Kong people that it is possible to navigate this structure without feeling that Hong Kong is going to fall apart?
Good question.
Perhaps I can just come to Richard to see what comments you have on any of these three strands.
Okay, let me try and keep it fairly brief. This is a new law, and with all new laws, there are uncertainties. No law ever comes perfectly. This is a controversial law. It makes radical changes, like any sort of law does. Here's the thing. No one can teach the Americans anything about marketing. The most drastic new national security law in the US was named the Patriot Act. So everybody has to feel patriotic, surely, about this and what it will do, and sit back and relax. Now, the name given by Beijing to this law is much more matter of fact. It's not got any marketing elements in it at all, although it says, let's safeguard national security together. But there is a huge amount of commentary which suggests that this is from the West, that this is a sinister move. There's something dark and grim going on here. Well, it's far too early to make any judgments of this sort one way or the other. I don't think that's the case at all. I think this law, as I've noted before, this is very much a reaction to all of the problems that were seen, particularly in 2019. The drafters in Beijing have had a checklist provided to them by the most extreme protesters who did this, that, and the other thing, whether it's going to America or throwing petrol bombs or whatever it is. And so it's quite focused. It's radical, but it's really quite focused. And we'll have to see how it works out. I think there's a wide recognition that you have to strike a balance. There always is. And let me just finally finish with an observation about Singapore. Many people who say that this is going to be bad for Hong Kong say, well, businesses and individuals who are mobile, they're going to leave. Maybe, maybe not. But one of the destinations they often cite where they're going to go to get away from all of this oppression and uncertainty in Hong Kong is Singapore. Well, the reason they want to go to Singapore is because it's so safe and secure. And a fundamental reason why it is so safe and secure is that it's got one of the most drastic national security regimes in the developed world. It's a regime which allows, in very extreme cases, somebody who commits a national security crime to be executed, for example, And just another quick example, the government, through the president, is able to order somebody to be held without trial who's a national security danger for up to 2 years, renewable, and it's not judicially reviewable. So people in Singapore, including all of the people, the expats and so on working there, they're, they've gotten used to this. Apparently everything thrives, business does wonderfully, but they've had a lot of time to get used to it. We haven't. We are going to have to do
now,
that.
I might as well pick a question here and ask you, Richard. There is some concern about the government here picking judges for hearing cases that are relating to national security. So the question here is, how do you see this? And is it common for other legal systems for the executive to pick judges?
Firstly, it's common for judges to specialise. So that's one thing. And there is some influence of the executive in other jurisdictions in order to find judges who can do this sort of specialised work. This is a new approach here in Hong Kong. But I think what's fundamental is that the pool of judges who will be nominated are judges who've gone through the normal rigorous training and selection systems in Hong Kong, which are as good as you can get anywhere. Indeed, I'd say they're more independent and more imbued with judicial independence and ability than many judges in the US are, where the process is very highly politicized, including to the Supreme Court. So if we're worried about picking judges, we might worry about how the US picks its Supreme Court judges, but apparently we're not, but we're worried about them. I don't say it's a matter of no consequence, but I think it's overstated. I have great confidence, as Chandran has mentioned, in the independence of the judiciary. I don't think it's improper or out of order.
Well, if I can go to Tony, because we also have a number of questions that relates to the parallel.
I'm happy to follow up on the
Yes.
questions you put to Richard.
Yes.
The first question you asked is whether there's a need for the central government's National Security Office in Hong Kong. My answer to that is very simple. Why shouldn't it be? I mean, national security must be a matter for the sovereign. And you don't expect the San Francisco police to deal with national security cases. All these cases would automatically be handed over to the FBI or CIA. So clearly the National Security Bureau have a role to ensure national security. So if the law is written in a way that all cases should be dealt with the central government's national security, I think it would be quite legally quite acceptable in international law aspect. But what the government actually doing is instead they actually delegate 99.9% of the cases to the local police to deal with it, and only leave certain possible small amount of cases, and it's listed very clearly the 3 exceptional circumstances that they can, only under those 3 exceptional circumstances they can act. So I would consider this is more a restraint rather than there is a sort of aggression to the Hong Kong's legal system. And secondly, I mean, this is the general perception. People are so afraid of the China, mainland China's legal system, the enforcement system, and they play a big role on that in this extradition law, etc. But for example, I can share my experience in relation to corruption. The mainland Chinese, they have an Interpol wanted list of 100 most wanted mainland Chinese involved in corruption. They actually issue it through the Interpol police. And of these 100 most wanted persons, so far as I'm aware, over 60 have already returned to China. And what are the countries which they return from? Mainly, of course, you can expect Western country. Some are returned from US, some from Australia, some from Europe, etc. And I would say I leave anyone to argue. Of these 60 cases which were returned to China for trial, there's no dispute whatsoever so far, no dispute whatsoever that anyone has been sort of under any maltreatment in the judicial process, etc. So China realized this is very important. If they conduct this extra sort of territorial matters, they must make sure this is properly done according to the judicial process. Because all they need is to spoil one case. If they spoil one case, then no country would be prepared to have extradition treaty with them. But if you look at the moment, I forget the number, certainly China have extradition treaty a lot more than over 100, I think it's about 100 countries, a lot more than what Hong Kong have. So I mean, this is a very strong misperception that people think that, oh, if the mainland police and they're taking action in Hong Kong and then the matter taken back to the mainland for trial, then there's no proper trial, there's mistreatment, and there's no human rights, etc. This is unfair. I think this is fair. We must remember we are talking about a China who's continued to improve his human right in judicial process. And this is different as compared with maybe 50 years, 60 years ago, okay? Yeah. The other thing I like to follow on these judges. I think Richard, of course, is correct. But what's wrong with the chief executive appointing judges? In fact, all judges in Hong Kong are appointed by the chief executive. He had the final say in making the appointment following the recommendation of the Judicial Committee. But the final appointment rests with the chief executive. So for her, or him or her, to reappoint the same judges whom he have already appointed, I can't see anything wrong with that. Because on the basis that we want some specialized judges to deal with it. And apart from that, I will be very honest. Can we trust all the judges on the bench? I mean, if you look at all the current riot protest related cases, there are many cases where you can see the judges are obviously taking a very biased, sympathetic view towards the protester. Now, we have cases where only yesterday we have a magistrate refused, allowed to grant bail to someone who flew an iron bar over the shopping arcade onto the police officers. I mean, this is attempted murder. In most cases, attempted murder, you will not give bail to anyone. But in Hong Kong, we have magistrates granting bail for people who are in possession of explosive. And when the prosecution suggests that at least please, magistrate, please give an order that they should not leave Hong Kong, refused. And then what happened? Quite a few people have already absconded. And why did they manage to get absconded? It's probably because of these gestures. So would we be comfortable appointing these kind of judges on the panel to deal with national security cases? This is on the practical point of view. Obviously, there should be some kind of proper vetting to ensure this person are unbiased, are fair, and also professional. I don't see anything wrong with that.
Well, I have a number of questions here that I'd like to address to Chandran, because some of them were addressed to you, about how do you think business people really look at this? I mean, you touched upon it already just now, but business people are worried about, their information, their data, because there is this overall fear that somehow the national security system can reach into information and data of private companies doing legitimate business here. How do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. In recent weeks, I've been speaking to a lot of business people, people in the lawmaking arena, and people in the financial industry, etc. That topic has never come up as a concern, and I'll give you one very good reason. Those of people who have lived in Hong Kong, who do business here, I think, as I said, and both Tony and Richard have said, how are very, very, not absolutely, but pretty confident of the robust institutional checks and balances we have. I mean, if those things are breached, then you could say we are in deep trouble. But the feeling is this will not happen. I also remember 1997 when I was here, the PLA came across in those trucks and was all over the world that the PLA has now arrived. Tomorrow you can expect to see them in the street. Well, we've never seen them on the streets of Hong Kong. But the more important thing is to understand, I've spoken to quite a few people who essentially have been involved, multinationals, in, can I say, the development of China, the investments. And I've been going in China and working in multinationals for close to about 25 years. There's no concern there about, I mean, there are accusations of intellectual property and all of that. But there's been hardly any concern about, our information being used against us as individuals, are we going to be jailed, et cetera, et cetera. So then there's hardly any incidents there. So multinationals continue to pile into China. It may change now because of the sanctions or whatever, we don't know. But in Hong Kong, I've not heard anyone voice that concern that much. What people have voiced a concern is what you've alluded to, and Tony has. The law is new. Like any law in any new country, and I'm not a legal specialist, but the proof is in the pudding. There's things called cases, etc., and all of that. And there is a concern being expressed that we should all be extremely diligent and make a positive contribution to make sure that the law is essentially administered in a way that doesn't undermine Hong Kong. That's what I've heard. But the majority of people have not talked about this fear about information about them being used against them or their families at all. The last point I would make, I did say flippantly, let's all chill. I'm not that naive. What I meant by that is, I think all of us who are one way or the other responsible, and particularly those who are politically engaged, we really need to take a deep breath and say, what outcomes do all of we want? We have seen that those of us who are all engaged the last 23 years, we have collectively failed. And that's why China had to intervene. And let's hope now that there's, but all of us now need to take a deep breath and say, let us make this work for Hong Kong. And so irrespective of your political persuasion, take a deep breath. What do we want Hong Kong to look like? And I think that's really a very important question. I suggest all of us involved in this debate in Hong Kong get involved in, particularly politicians.
Well, let me then touch on the issue of dissent versus subversion, because I think this is where people who are politically active, people who are in non-government organizations, NGOs, are concerned about. How do we help them to think through, carry on with their normal activity, but that isn't going to, that's normal dissent. And I don't hear anyone from Beijing or Hong Kong government saying you can't disagree with them anymore. But where might we touch the line on subversion? Richard, from a legal point of view, I think we're talking about the criminal law. Intent is important. How do you think we can reassure people who are active in public affairs that there is actually a great margin of safety?
I think as I said, it's early days here, but I think there are two really clear areas where people can draw a line themselves, and a sensible line, I should say. So however active you are, you make it clear by deed and by word, you are completely against political violence. That's a fundamental starting point, and I think a lot of people have gotten dragged into the mess.
So you take terrorism, one of the four new sets of crime completely out of the picture. Would that be correct?
It's likely, yes, yeah. I mean,
but terrorism is not just violence.
No,
Yeah.
no. This involves subversion as well, and it depends what the purpose is. But if you step back completely and make it clear that you are hostile to violence and you're willing to condemn it when anybody else does it, that's what did not happen last year on a huge scale. Many people said nothing, or if they did say something, often it was some sort of apology for the violence. So that would be one. The other one is, it is clear now you're going to have to be very careful about money. Now, talking to people, having arguments and debates with them about what might be a better system of government or not, I think that's not going to be a major danger, quite frankly. But if you start taking money, there's evidence. If you start taking money from somebody from a group overseas who are actively involved in supporting, let's say, the United States position against China, then that's risky.
Well, you are at the University of Hong Kong, and at universities there are all kinds of activities, discussions, and so on.
Yes.
And for example, at Hong Kong U, the Faculty of Law, you're having seminars to discuss the national security law.
Sure.
So that's actually a very good thing, because we all want deeper knowledge. But for example, if there was some overseas funder that has, let's say, some money from foreign governments who wants to support some activity, seminars and so on in Hong Kong on, let's say, human rights related or democratic reform issues, democracy issues.
Yes.
I mean, how close is the line that, you don't want to sail too close to the wind, let's say.
Yes.
So how can we, again, assure people that it's possible to have all kinds of legitimate discussion, but finding that, not crossing that line? I think that's what people are worried about.
Well, with money always, the question is, what are the strings attached? And so you should be careful, as I say. If somebody's offering you money, then you ought to be thinking about what is their agenda. And if it is, you do with the money what you like, honestly, I don't think there's going to be a big problem. It's the question about what's their motive. Why do they want to give you the money? And, there are legitimate reasons to be concerned now. We've got some hard evidence, finally, probably tip of the iceberg, but we know from a Time magazine article that the National Endowment for Democracy, through the funding body for Voice of America, has spent some millions of dollars in Hong Kong recently to support the protest movement. That's now on the public record. So that's obviously not going to be possible any longer. I can't give you a neat formula at this stage,
right.
But the precautionary principle here says you can get on with most of what you want to get on with, but be careful about violence, very careful, and careful about money.
I'm going to go to Tony, but before that, perhaps Chandran.
I just wanted to say that, I think unless you have a real clear intent to essentially gain support from people who have on their own, on their mission to undermine Hong Kong, you don't go and do these things. We all live in countries where there are laws, and so you don't go and take money from someone, because you don't go and take money from anybody. You know who they are, and you know what their intentions are. And so why would you want to do that? I think for most people, and I don't want to use it's only a small minority going to be affected by the law thing, but as your pertinent question, for most people, people make judgment calls about, is this legitimate? Should I do this? And I'm part of a larger society, so I have an obligation to make sure that the law is not tested in ways that would undermine my own freedoms, etc. So I think that's really important for people to understand. And I think it's also really important that people do use the frameworks in Hong Kong to check. So if I'm going to take money from someone, I might write to the government and say, is this kosher? Is this okay? If I'm in doubt. But if I'm really trying to do something that I think flies very close, then I don't want to tell them. And then, it'll be tested. And as I said, I hope that the the system in Hong Kong will not punish people for making mistakes like that. I mean, that's important.
Right. Well, Tony, you have the final word, and then I'm going to come back to Chandran and Richard for their final word. Maybe this is an area you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, as a conclusion, I really like to say that the Hong Kong people should reflect on this very simple question. When I talk about this national security law, what happens to Hong Kong and its future if Hong Kong do not have a national security law? Firstly, we talk about, for example, the US consulate. They have 1,600 staff, which is quite unbelievable in a small place like Hong Kong, 1,600 staff. So how many of them actually may be engaged in espionage spy activity? We don't know, but we have reasons to doubt. So if we don't have, at the moment, probably the Hong Kong existing law is unable to deal with this kind of this international espionage operation, the Five Eyes spy network, which is certainly take place in Hong Kong. We cannot do anything about these cases. So do we honestly want these organizations to continue to thrive, continue to provide millions and millions of dollars of funds to support our protests, to support our rioters? As Richard said, that we're talking about $20 million given to the protesters, as revealed in one recent cases. So this is absolutely necessary. If we don't have this national security law, the Hong Kong will getting the social disorder will never finish. And then from international and historical experience, the separatist movement, the Hong Kong independence movement, for many countries, it undoubtedly, inevitably leads to violence. You look at the Northern Ireland seeking for independence from the UK, and then all this IRA. Thousands and thousands of people were killed. In the Philippines, which I'm quite well aware of, the Mindanao Island seeking for independence. Again, a lot of violence took place. So if we say that, oh, it's no harm for Hong Kong to put up a poster and then to say that we want Hong Kong independence, we want separation, this separatism will undoubtedly lead to chaos and violence. And this is what every one of us needs to seriously reflect. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Some final words?
I mean, I'll just reflect on. I lived in Africa for 5 years, and I'm not trying to make any direct comparisons, but the point that when you don't have law and order, then terrible things happen. So you need to. Hong Kong people, I think, all of us need to recognize the time, the moment we're in, and which is my view that Hong Kong is the portal for the clash. And that clash has been a long time coming, maybe 100 years or more, and it is now here. We have to act very responsibly. And finally, I'd say, to the sovereign has a great responsibility now to make sure that it administers the law in a way that gains the confidence of the people of Hong Kong. I think the people of Hong Kong are very smart, they are astute, they will figure this out. And to those who feel that their political needs or their demands are not being fulfilled, I would urge them to use the new law in a way so that we can all get involved in what I call purposeful and meaningful politics. And let's solve the largest social issues in Hong Kong, which is essential social inequality. And one of the richest city-states in the world should not have the social inequality. That's what we need to be working on. And I would cheekily end by saying, if you can use the national security law to solve that problem, that would be fantastic.
Richard, final word.
Okay. I think that the national security law follows a pattern of intervention by Beijing in Hong Kong, especially if you look at Article 158 of the Basic Law. It's problem solving. It's radical, but it's very focused. It's not wide-ranging and sweeping. as it could have been. It might have been that we would have had the mainland national security law here, for example. So I think Beijing are definitely trying to achieve a balance. They want to solve the problem. The bottom line is we must not ever go back to 2019. But a really drastic way of ensuring that is off the table because they want Hong Kong to thrive. And they're confident, and so am I, that if once we get back stability, continuing stability, that will happen. It still leaves many problems to address, as Chandran has identified so well. But I think what we've seen, I know this is a bit radical to say, but what really we're seeing is a vote of confidence. That is, Hong Kong has a real future. Yeah. We may not like this law. Yeah. It could be better. It's not perfect. Yeah. But it's a real attempt to strike a balance so that we can be stable, Beijing feels comfortable, and we can move forward. And who knows, if we are stable and comfortable, the matter of political reform could come back on the agenda.
True. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching this program, and thank you to the three speakers for sharing their perspective with us. I found it very enlightening because we've gone from a very big macro issue of geopolitics right down to how we operate the law here in Hong Kong. I'm sure that in the days to come, Hong Kong will continue to debate and talk about the issue, and there's much to learn from all of us. Thank you very much again.